When I first got the job as a night watchman at the old train station, I thought it was going to be the easiest gig in the world. The place had been abandoned for decades, a relic of a busier time that no one seemed to care about anymore. Everything about it screamed forgotten. Rusty tracks covered in weeds, benches stained by time, and faded advertisements for long-defunct businesses. It felt like stepping into a time capsule nobody bothered to seal properly. My supervisor handed me the keys and joked about how I'd probably spend most nights fighting off boredom. He mentioned that the station speaker system still worked but added, almost as an afterthought, not that there's ever a reason to use it. At the time, I shrugged it off. The first night was exactly what I expected, uneventful and eerily quiet. I paced the main hall to kill time, my boots echoing against the cracked tiles. The wind howled through shattered windows, rattling loose panes and sending an occasional chill down my spine. I'd brought a thermos of coffee to keep myself awake, but it felt unnecessary. The oppressive silence was more than enough to keep me alert. Around 2 a.m., I thought I heard a faint crackle from the overhead speakers. Static, maybe? I wrote it off as interference or a glitch in the ancient wiring. Still, something about it felt off, like the sound was deliberate, almost purposeful. The second night, the static came back. This time, it was louder, breaking the stillness like an unwelcome guest. I froze mid-step in the main hall, staring up at the dusty speakers mounted high on the walls. The sound wasn't constant. It came in bursts, like someone fumbling with a microphone. Then, for just a second, I swore I heard something else buried in the noise. A voice. It was faint, garbled, and completely unintelligible, but unmistakably there. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for it to repeat, but the static eventually faded into silence. I tried to shake it off. Old equipment, I told myself. Probably interference from somewhere, but as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was trying to get my attention. By the third night, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The static had evolved into something much worse. It started with a low hum, barely audible, that slowly grew louder and more distorted until it filled the entire station. Then came the whispers. They didn't sound like a single person but a crowd, all speaking at once in some strange, unintelligible language. I stood frozen in the main hall, my pulse pounding in my ears as the whispers seemed to surround me, coming from every direction. My chest tightened as I strained to catch even a single word, but nothing made sense. Just when I thought I couldn't take it any more, the speakers crackled loudly, and the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse, like the station itself was holding its breath. That night, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to check the control room to figure out what was causing the sounds. It was a cramped, dingy space at the far end of the station, filled with old monitors and panels coated in a thick layer of dust. Most of the equipment had been disconnected years ago. Half the wires hung loose or were corroded beyond recognition. The speaker system had its own control panel, but when I inspected it, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. It wasn't even plugged in. The cables were frayed and dangling, far from any power source. Yet somehow, the voices had been coming through loud and clear. I stood there for a long moment, feeling a cold sweat creep down my neck. This wasn't just a technical glitch. On my way back to the main hall, I heard it again. The whispers. This time, they weren't just noise. They were words. Clear, deliberate words. Next stop, the voice announced, dragging the syllables out like a train conductor making an eerie proclamation. I froze in place, trying to make sense of what I'd just heard. Next stop, despair. My legs felt like they were made of lead, and my breath hitched in my throat. The voice sounded human, but there was something deeply unnatural about it, like it was being played in reverse, then sped up just enough to be intelligible. I wanted to leave right then and there, but something about the station felt different, like the air had gotten heavier, trapping me inside. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe I was tired, or maybe the isolation was getting to me. But as I walked back toward the main hall, the voice returned, and this time it was unmistakably addressing me. "Passenger," it said, followed by a long, static-filled pause. "Prepare for boarding." My blood ran cold. The words were calm, almost formal, but laced with a mechanical distortion that made them feel alien. I scanned the empty station, expecting to see someone, anyone, lurking in the shadows, but I was completely alone. At least, I thought I was. That's when the lights started flickering, casting the station in brief flashes of harsh, white light followed by suffocating darkness. The flickering wasn't random. It felt deliberate, like it was trying to guide me somewhere. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst as I turned toward the source of the sound. The overhead speakers crackled to life again, and the voice spoke once more, this time with an unsettling precision. "He's in the main hall." My stomach twisted into knots. It was narrating my movements. Before I could process what was happening, the voice continued, now approaching the south corridor. Panic surged through me. I wasn't moving, but somehow it knew where I was. Or worse, it was controlling where I went. I couldn't stay still any longer. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but when I bolted for the main entrance, I found the heavy glass doors locked. They shouldn't have been. I'd unlocked them myself at the start of my shift. I yanked at them with all my strength, but they wouldn't budge. The flickering lights above me grew more erratic, casting distorted shadows across the walls. I turned back toward the main hall, desperate for another way out, but what I saw stopped me in my tracks. Through the warped windows of an abandoned train car on the platform, dark shapes were moving. They weren't human. Too tall, too thin, with twisted forms that seemed to shimmer in and out of focus. The voice from the speakers came again, now louder and more insistent. "Passenger, proceed to the platform." I shook my head, backing away instinctively. "No," I whispered, even though there was no one to hear me. As if in response, the shadows in the train car jerked violently, like they were trying to break free. The lights above me flared one last time before plunging the station into complete darkness. I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears as I fumbled for my flashlight. When I finally managed to turn it on, the beam barely pierced the oppressive blackness around me. The train car was empty now, or at least it looked empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been inside was now much closer. I stumbled backward, clutching the flashlight like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. The air felt heavier with every passing second, thick and suffocating, as if the station itself was alive and watching me. The flashlight flickered, and I felt my knees weaken as the voice returned, this time clearer and closer. "Boarding now," it said, dragging out the last word in a warped, guttural tone. I swung the flashlight toward the platform, and for a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing near the edge. It was blurry, like a smudge on a camera lens, but the shape was unmistakable. A tall, gaunt silhouette that seemed to ripple and distort as it moved. I couldn't take it any more. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing through the empty corridors. The speakers roared to life again, louder and more frantic, shouting my name now, over and over, like a warning, or a command. "Get to the platform," they bellowed, but the distortion made it sound more like a growl. My legs burned as I sprinted toward the control room, the only place that felt remotely safe. I threw the door shut behind me and pressed my back against it, gasping for breath. The room was freezing cold, my breath visible in short, frantic bursts. As I tried to collect myself, I noticed something on the desk that hadn't been there before. An old, leather-bound notebook, its pages worn and yellowed with age. I didn't remember seeing the notebook during my earlier check of the control room, but there it was, right in the center of the desk as if waiting for me. My hands trembled as I flipped it open. The first few pages were filled with hastily scribbled notes, dates, times, and what looked like fragments of sentences. Heard it again. Can't be real. Static won't stop. The writing grew more frantic as I turned the pages, the sentences breaking apart into desperate scrawls. Voices said my name. Train isn't supposed to be here. They're watching. My stomach churned as I reached the last entry. The ink was smeared, but I could still make out the words. Passenger list updated. Next boarding, me. My heart sank as I looked closer at the page. Beneath the final entry, there was a list of names, each followed by a date. Most of them were decades old, but at the very bottom was my own name, underlined in shaky handwriting. The date next to it was today's. I slammed the notebook shut, bile rising in my throat. The speakers crackled to life again, making me jump. "It's time," the voice said, soft and almost soothing this time. But there was no comfort in it. It sounded final, like a death sentence. Before I could think, the control room lights flickered and went out completely, plunging me into darkness. The only sound was my ragged breathing and the faint hum of the speakers overhead. My flashlight, still clutched tightly in my hand, refused to turn back on no matter how many times I clicked the button. Then, from somewhere deep within the station, came a sound that froze me in place. A low, metallic screech, like train wheels grinding against rusted tracks. It was impossible. No trains had run here in years. But the sound grew louder, closer, reverberating through the walls like a pulse. I pressed my ear to the door, hoping to hear something, anything that would make sense of the noise. But what I heard wasn't the sound of a train or machinery. It was footsteps, slow, deliberate, and getting closer. My breath caught in my throat as I realized they weren't coming from the hallway outside the control room. They were coming from the platform. Summoning every ounce of courage I had left, I cracked the door open and peeked down the corridor. The platform was illuminated now, bathed in an eerie, bluish light that seemed to shimmer like a mirage. And there, sitting on the tracks, was a train, a single ancient-looking car with windows glowing faintly from within. The train shouldn't have been there. It looked older than the station itself, its metal surface tarnished and covered in streaks of grime. The faint blue light from inside cast long, distorted shadows across the platform. My gut screamed at me to run, to get as far away from this impossible sight as I could, but my legs refused to move. Then, as if sensing my hesitation, the speakers crackled one last time. "Boarding now," the voice said, low and hollow, with an unnatural calm that sent a shiver down my spine. I don't know why I stepped forward. Maybe it was the voice, compelling me. Maybe it was sheer curiosity, overriding my fear. Whatever the reason, I found myself walking toward the platform, each step feeling heavier than the last. As I approached, the train's door creaked open, revealing only darkness inside. My flashlight flickered back to life, but the beam couldn't penetrate the void within the car. I stood at the edge of the platform, staring into the blackness, every instinct screaming at me to stop. And then, just as I was about to turn and run, I felt something behind me, a presence, cold, overwhelming, and inescapable. I didn't dare turn around. Whatever was behind me, it was close. I could feel the icy weight of it pressing against my back. My breath came in shallow gasps as I stood frozen, torn between running and stepping into the train. The speakers crackled again, but this time there was no voice, just the sound of static and something else beneath it. Breathing, slow, deep, and ragged like someone, or something, waiting just beyond my reach. I couldn't take it any more. With a shaky exhale, I stepped onto the train, feeling the floorboards creak under my weight. As soon as I crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me with a metallic clang that echoed through the empty car. I spun around, gripping the flashlight tightly, but the door was gone. In its place was a solid wall of rusted metal, as if it had never existed. The interior of the train was suffocatingly cold, and the faint blue light pulsed, casting strange shadows that seemed to shift and writhe. Rows of seats stretched out before me, but they weren't empty. Dark shapes occupied them, humanoid but wrong, their forms flickering like static on an old TV. None of them moved, but I could feel their attention fixed on me, heavy and unrelenting. The air inside the train felt thicker, like trying to breathe through water. The figures in the seats didn't move, but their presence was suffocating, as if the weight of their gaze alone could crush me. My flashlight flickered again, the beam growing weaker with every second, barely illuminating the aisle ahead. I forced myself to take a step forward, then another, each footfall echoing unnaturally loud in the cramped space. The closer I got to the center of the car, the stronger the sense of being watched became. My skin prickled as if unseen eyes were crawling over me, dissecting my every move. When I reached the middle of the car, the speakers overhead crackled to life again. This time the voice was louder, clearer, and unmistakably human, but distorted, like it was being dragged through layers of static. "Welcome aboard," it said, with a tone that almost sounded amused. My flashlight gave out completely, plunging me into the faint, unnatural glow of the train's interior. The voice returned, softer now, but more insidious. "Final stop. Your reckoning." The seats behind me creaked, the sound of old leather groaning under sudden movement. I turned, heart hammering, and saw the figures rising slowly, their twisted forms now moving toward me with jerky, unnatural steps. Panic took over. I stumbled backward, tripping over the uneven floor as the figures closed in. Their movements were unnatural, like marionettes controlled by an unsteady hand, their limbs bending at impossible angles. My back hit the far wall of the car, the cold metal biting through my jacket. I banged my fists against it, searching for an escape, but there was nothing. No door, no window, just solid, unyielding steel. The figures were closer now, their outlines shimmering like heat waves, distorting the air around them. And then, just as one reached out an impossibly long arm, everything stopped. The figures froze mid-step, the blue light flickered violently, and the train lurched. A low, bone-rattling hum filled the car, growing louder and louder until it was all I could hear. My vision blurred as the light seemed to implode, collapsing into total darkness. For a moment there was nothing, no sound, no sight, just an endless void. Then, without warning, I was back on the platform. The train was gone, the station silent once again. My flashlight was in my hand, working perfectly, and the doors to the main hall were wide open, as if nothing had happened. I stood there on the platform, shaking uncontrollably. The oppressive cold of the train was gone, replaced by the stale, damp air of the abandoned station. Everything was still, unnervingly so. No flickering lights, no voices from the speakers, just silence. For a brief, fleeting moment, I thought maybe I had hallucinated the whole thing. Maybe the isolation, the stress, or even sleep deprivation had gotten to me. But then I glanced at my watch. It was frozen at 3:13 a.m., the exact time I had heard the first voice that night. As I walked back toward the control room, trying to steady my breathing, a creeping sense of unease followed me. It felt like the walls of the station were watching, judging my every step. When I entered the room, I froze. The notebook was gone. The desk was empty, save for the faint imprint of where it had been. My mind raced, searching for some kind of explanation, but before I could think too hard about it, my eyes landed on the control panel. There, in the corner of the screen, was a schedule I hadn't seen before. My name was at the very bottom, next to the words "boarding confirmed."